Hello students, I am Dr. Supriya Mandloi from the Department of English, the Bhopal School of Social Sciences. The lecture for today is on European classical literature and the session title is A Brief Introduction. In this lecture, we are going to cover major areas associated with European literature. To take a quick look at the various topics that we will cover in this session are, first we will look at what is classical literature, the archaic period. Later on, we'll take a look at what makes a thing classic, the doyens of classical literature, prominent works from classical literature, key aspects of classical literature, and finally, we will conclude with the themes in the various classical works of literature. What is classical literature? Classical literature refers to all works written during the ancient Greco-Roman civilization. So, the countries in context are Greece and Italy. In those days, Italy was not the term that was commonly used. It was primarily Rome, which was the seat of learning. These works were written in ancient Greek and Roman dialect. European classical literature ranges from the oldest surviving written works until works from approximately the 5th century AD. So, if you look at it, the works which fall in the pre-Christian era are primarily termed as classics with respect to the European literature. So, in those days, Greece and Rome or Greek and Roman literatures were thriving because both Greece and Roman cities were the seats of learning. All the prominent writers were from these major cities of Europe, and also all the prominent works in literature were written during these periods. Classical antiquity is the period in which Greek and Roman literature such as the works of Aeschylus, Ovid and other writers were written. By convention, if you look at it, the period starts with the work of Homer, who is the most prominent writer of the Greek literature. The period of Homer is around somewhere 8th to 7th century BC. So, BC, as you are all familiar with, is the before Christ period, which is also termed as the pre-Christian era. It ends with the arrival of Christianity and the decline of the Roman Empire, which happened somewhere around 5th and 6th century AD. So, with the arrival of Christianity, we start with the AD period, from whence onward we have a new field of writings in literature. The archaic period. In our next section, that is archaic period, we will look at the literature which is written during the 8th to 6th century BC, which we are already referring to as the classical literature, and works which were written during these centuries, they were termed as archaic. Archaic refers to something which is obsolete also, old also, even dialects and language, even words that have been used from this period have henceforth been termed as archaic. The earliest period of classical antiquity took place before the reappearance of historical sources after the Bronze Age collapse. We are all familiar with the Iron Age, the Copper Age, the Bronze Age. Now, when we look at historical evidences, in classical literature, most of these works were written in the form of manuscripts because printing press had not yet come up. We are all familiar that the printing press was invented in the age of Renaissance. So, in the absence of anything called as printing press, most of these were handwritten. A lot of it was passed in the form of oral tradition. So, when it was passed on to the subsequent generation, a lot of it got lost, maybe because of flood, maybe because of invasions from neighboring lands. So, a lot of destruction of these literature, these monuments of antiquity happened during these periods. So, what is left with us is what we have received from the classical period. So, historical evidences are sufficient to help us understand from which age we can reconstruct classical history. The earliest Greek alphabetic inscriptions are in the first half of the 8th century. Now, the very concept of writing, the form of, coming up with alphabets, calligraphy, all these were of a later origin. So, oral tradition or oral form of communication was primarily used, and this we will take up subsequently in the segment where we will take up the features of classical literature. Homer is usually assumed to have lived in the 8th to 7th century, and his lifetime is often taken as marking the beginning of classical literature. Also classical antiquity, because Homer stands at the apex of all the great Greek works of literature, and Homer's writings have also you could say left a tradition behind for writers of subsequent ages to compose their literary works around the benchmark and the tradition laid out by Homer. It is interesting to note that the date the accepted date for the first ancient Olympic Games was in 776 BC, which was also around this time. In Roman legend, the city of Rome was also founded in 753 BC. The earliest settlement at Roman Forum seemed to have taken place around this time. So these are the historical evidences which form our basis for understanding the time and the dates of composition of these works, since they are based and they were written during a time of which no living records are available for us. All our understanding is primarily based on the historical evidences like monuments, like these works of art, the great Colosseum, the pyramids of Giza, or you have these very ancient architectural structures standing in the historical cities of Europe. These are the places from where we get a fair idea about the kind of works that were written. Since nobody from that time survived, and there is a long gap between the subsequent generations of writing and these writings which were written in the pre-Christian era, it's a bit difficult to identify their specific age, the right date to ascribe to such works as to when they were composed. So it's important for us to depend on these evidences provided to us by monuments, pieces of art and architecture, from where we construct a history of classical literature. A very important question that I would like to cover in this session is, what makes a thing classic? You have classical songs, you have classical movies, you have classical art. So what makes a thing classic? Let us take each one of this idea individually. First thing, a work of classic expresses artistic quality. Art is a work of creation. Art connects us with God. Art is immortal. And artistic creations, it is said and it was believed in ancient times, are only available with the people who are blessed by God. It's not everybody's forte to compose a work of art, to create a work of art. So any work of art, any work of writing, any piece of literature, any song, any movie, if it has artistic quality, if it can communicate beyond the accepted norms of communication, if it can communicate and convey an eternal truth, it is a work of art. It has artistic quality, where imagination, where observation, and where an understanding of the deeper eternal truths find a place. The second important quality of a work of art would be, it stands the test of time. Time equalizes, or time levels all. Time will pardon none. This is what is the general belief. With the passage of time, a lot of things get lost to us, that are no longer available to us. There are destructions caused by war, natural calamities, and there are also changes that happen over a period of time with regards to the opinion, the taste, and the mannerisms of the people. Language changes, people's likes and dislikes changes, civilization and culture changes. But if anything stands and survives beyond these boundaries, If anything is accepted and appreciated beyond these boundaries, then it has stood the test of time. For instance, if we look at William Shakespeare wrote some 400 to 500 years ago approximately, and we still read Shakespeare, even though his times have changed, the culture has changed, the civilizations have changed. But Shakespeare has made himself relevant and it has survived. It has survived in terms of its appreciation and its acceptance amongst the people, and therefore it's a classic. The same applies to Homer also. It has universal appeal. People across the world, beyond geographical boundaries, appreciate a work of art, then it's a classic. It is translated into several languages. It lends itself to multiple meanings. It is not confined to a nation, a region, or a group of people, but it is loved and cherished by people across the globe. Then it is a work of classic. And it helps people to make connections. People can make multiple interpretations out of these works, and therefore it is called a classic. Finally, it is relevant to multiple generations. I am reading Shakespeare in the 22nd century. Somebody read Shakespeare in the 16th century. Somebody read him in the 15th century. See, generations have changed, but Shakespeare is still there. Therefore, he is a work of art. Therefore, his writings are a work of art. Therefore, what he wrote has become a classic. All Greek works, all Roman works of antiquity, they have been cherished. They have sustained the test of time. They help people to make multiple connections, and they lend themselves to multiple interpretations, and therefore they all fall in the category of a classic. Christianity played a lot of role in helping the works of classical age survive and sustain the test of time. Survive and stand the test of time, so to say, because Christianity in its process of carving out new colonies helped in the spread of these works of literature, which were initially written in Greco-Roman dialect. Latin was the most popular language, and along with Greek, both Greek and Latin languages were the languages in which these works were written, and therefore when Christianity came and when Christian missionaries went out to establish colonies, went out in the spread of Christianity, that was the time when they brought these works of literature in the European nations, in the other continents of the world, and that is how they were brought to the rest of the world. Otherwise, we might have just lost them to history. Subsequently, these works of literature were transmitted to the vernacular languages, and that is how an interpretation of these works, a translation of these works was possible. So, all the works which were written during this period were subsequently translated into English, and therefore we were able to enjoy and cherish these works of antiquity. Some examples of classical literature when we talk about refer to the works by Homer. His prominent works were the Iliad and the Odyssey, which talk about the Greek Trojan War and the exploits of the Greek ruler Odysseus. We also have a prominent work by Sophocles, who was a prominent dramatist of the contemporary times. He wrote his tragedies, which were written around the house of Thebes. These were the masterpieces of the Greek literature. Some of the famous Greek playwrights who wrote during this period were Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles. These three dramatists used to participate in a competition which was conducted in order to celebrate the festival of Dionysius, the Greek god of fertility and wine. 3 plays were written individually by each of these writers, which were known as trilogies, and they were staged and performed. Those were the times when only men used to perform, women and slaves had no identity. So these plays were performed with the performers wearing masks so that they can fully depict the different emotions of sorrow, grief, anger, bravery, and therefore mask was a common practice. And of these, Sophocles was the most popular because he won these competitions several times, and therefore he also has given us the tradition of how a tragedy should be written. Along with Greek classical literature, we also have the Roman classical literature, and some of the prominent Roman writers of antiquity were Horace, Seneca, and Plautus. Horace was known for his satires. Seneca for his tragedies, and Plautus for his comedies. We have the term Horatian satires primarily from the Roman writer Horace. Plautus gave us the very prominent and amazing comedy which was termed as the twin brothers of Antiquity or the brothers Menachemi, which is based around a confusion of identities and all the interesting incidents that revolve around such confusion. It is interesting also to note that these Roman writers were deeply inspired by Homer. They also tried to create a legacy for Roman literature, since most of these works were written in Latin, and they felt that just as Greek language has survived, so also Latin will be able to create a masterpiece, and therefore these works were composed. Alongside these writers, there was also one more writer who refers mention here, and his name is Virgil. Virgil's famous and most popular work was the Aeneid, which was written around the Greek hero, the Trojan War hero Aeneas, who escapes from the war of Troy, who is the only survival from the war of Troy, and he goes out to find a new city where the next generation of people will live. And this task was given to Virgil by the Roman ruler Augustus Caesar, and he wanted this work to become a legacy, a national epic, just as Homer's Iliad had become a national epic. Some of the prominent classical works I have already mentioned: Virgil's Aeneid and Plautus' Menachemi brothers. The Menachemi by Plautus is a comedy about mistaken identity involving a set of twins, Menachemus of Epidamnus and Menachemus of Syracuse. The Aeneid, as I've already mentioned, is a Latin epic poem written by Virgil between 29 and 19 BC, which tells the legendary story of Aeneas, a Trojan hero who fled the fall of Troy and traveled to Italy, where he became the ancestor of the Romans. Before we wind up our session, let's take a look at the key aspects of classical literature. First of all, the dates of composition vary, but one thing that we can identify and be clear is that these were written somewhere around 800 BC. These were oral in nature because writing as a form of communication was in its initial stages of evolution. First came poetry, and subsequently other forms of writing were used for literary purposes. These were primarily meant to be sung or recited. Mostly myths and legends were used as forms of stories. We often see an intervention of gods and goddesses in the lives and stories of these heroes who are a part of these classical works. At the beginning of Greek literature stands the work of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Some of the major themes that were covered in classical literature were great battles. For instance, the War of Troy is the center of most of these classical works. Fall of tragic heroes who are standing at the very apex of their life, who are respected and honored like gods. For example, Oedipus, and how because of a flaw in their personality, they fall. Tragic stories from royal houses such as the House of Argos, the House of Thebes, the conflict between good versus evil, redemption, that there is always a scope to correct yourself, revenge, sin, because we are all mortal beings who have common human weaknesses and follies, and therefore there is always a way to redeem ourselves, and we are prone to misery only because of the sins that we cover, only because of the sins that we make or fall prey to. And finally, betrayal in love, or the very desire to overcome one's passion, are some of the themes which are covered in works of classical literature. I hope this session has given you a fair idea of what is classic, what are the prominent classical works in literature, and this is what is essential in our preliminary understanding of European classical literature. Thank you.